I came out to myself. I figured out I was queer in 1996 when I was 34 years old, been married for 10 years and had a 3-year-old son. So I was a late bloomer. I got my first clue when I was at the movies with another church girlfriend, and there were 2 movies at the same time playing. One was, they're both about angels. One was Michael with John Travolta as playing the Archangel Michael, and the other was The Preacher's Wife with Denzel Washington playing an angel and Whitney Houston. And after trying to decide back and forth for a while, my friend turned to me and said, well, who would you rather look at for the next 2 hours, Denzel or John? And without thinking about it, I said, Whitney. And she looked at me, and I kind of was like, looked at her. She said, well, what does that mean? I was like, does it have to mean anything? She said, you might want to think about it. Like, okay, it's not ordinary for 30-something church ladies to have celebrity crushes on Whitney Houston? Who knows? Anyway, so I looked around, and no one had ever asked me before who I'd like to look at. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, I was told who not to look at, what not to do, and that all involved boys. It wasn't much of a struggle. So when I started looking around for myself and saying, who do I like to look at? Turned out it was all women. And so I went home and told my husband, hey, looks like I might be gay. And he said, well, are you going to do anything about it? He meant leave him or get in a relationship. And I was like, no, I had every intention of staying married. So we stayed married for another 15 years. And I was attending a fairly conservative church, a Churches of Christ congregation. And we continued along until he decided the marriage was over for other reasons. And that's when I came out sort of to the world. So this was 2010, and I was doing a lot of volunteering, and I found out about an organization that was then called the Gay Christian Network. And they had a local Bible study, and though my church was very conservative, I had always had queer friends. I had always been around affirming people. And I walked into this Bible study, and I was the only, what we called side B person there. And they were like, are you going to be okay with the fact that your Bible study leader is married to another man? I'm like, sure, why not? They said, well, okay. And I said, are you going to be okay with the fact that I wouldn't marry another woman? And they were like, well, okay. And we got to be really good friends. And I attended that Bible study for like 5 years. At the same time, along that time, I got invited to speak at a children's ministry conference. At my very conservative church, I was the children's ministry leader. And I got invited to talk about anything I wanted to, and I said I wanted to talk about making churches safer for LGBTQ kids and their families. And so, since I was going to be standing up on a stage with a name tag with the name of my church on it, talking about being queer, I figured I'd better come out to my elders. So I had a little conversation with them, and these were guys who I'd known for at least 10 years, and we're good friends. So I told them, well, it looks like I'm going to be coming out as queer. And then they had the same question my husband had. Are you going to do anything about it? And at that point I was like what, take out a billboard? But I had expected that once I made this announcement, they'd ask me to step down from children's ministry. But they didn't, let alone kick me out of the church. In fact, at the next watch night service, I was asked to give my testimony. So they were very welcoming of me. Now, I think if I had been a man in children's ministry or youth ministry and came out as gay, it might have been different. And I know a lot of folks had lost their jobs over things like that. But I had a very gentle experience coming out. That I began looking for other forms of community. And unlike a lot of people, I didn't lose my church or my job. There wasn't anything that really challenged my faith about coming out. It was mostly about freedom and finding a new community, this whole great rainbow of folks that I now realized I had something in common with. But I didn't like living alone after my divorce. I lived alone for a couple of years and wasn't happy. So while I was at this GCM Bible study in Baltimore, we read a book by a guy named Tim Otto, who happened to live in an intentional community with friends of mine from college. So when I was moving out of the DC area, I decided to move into my current community. I live in an intentional community in San Francisco, and we are what's called a third way church, so that we have people in leadership that are both more affirming and more traditional. We have preachers on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, both of whom are queer. So we have a nice balance. So for me, again, I landed in what I feel is sort of the best of all possible worlds. The first way I realized I was queer was the Whitney Houston story, when I realized that if I was attracted to anyone, I was attracted to women. As I spent more time in the rainbow community, I realized there were a lot more shades of queer than that. And I've realized over time that I'm probably on the asexual spectrum as well. So one of the reasons I didn't figure out I was gay until I was 34 is that I didn't fall in love with anyone. Most women of my generation figured out they were queer by falling in love. And that wasn't my circumstance. It was kind of hypothetical at that point. And now, the more language I know, the more I'm fascinated by it. These kids these days, they're making up all these new words. And every time I go to a conference, I hear new terms. And for me, at this point, being queer means being somewhat attracted to women occasionally, and mostly not experiencing that as much of a struggle or an issue in my life. But it also means being part of a community that's much bigger than I thought it was. It's not just gay Christians. It's not even just gay. It's gay, pan, bi, poly, ace, all these things. And all of the varieties of trans, non-binary, gender fluid, gender questioning, gender queer. There are so many different ways to be queer, and it seems like there are more all the time. And I think that's partly people realizing that they're allowed to have language that really expresses them. They don't have to fit in old boxes. And I think that's a great thing. A friend and I, a male gay friend, and I were at a meeting. And then after the meeting, he asked me if some guy was there. It was a fairly large room. And I'm like, I don't know. And I asked him if a female was there. And he's like, I don't know. And we realized we saw the room completely differently. It had nothing to do with sexual behavior. It had nothing to do with attraction either, even. The whole oriented to, how are you oriented in the world? I think being queer provides a totally different orientation than being straight. And it's not so much what I do as how I experience the world. That makes sense. That's good language for it. Even if we're celibate, even if we're asexual, even if we're long time married to the same person of either gender, we see the world and experience the world and are hit by things in the world in a different way. So before I identified as queer, jokes sounded different because I didn't know they applied to me. And I had always had, gay and lesbian friends, and I would stick up for them. But when it's something internal, it just hits differently, for good or for ill. I think it's also the idea that being queer sort of by definition puts you more toward the margins than in the mainstream. And the view's always different from the margins. Not only the power differentials, but just the social patterns, all of those things. And I have a friend who talks about queer treasure. And the idea that the perspectives and the ways that queer folks see things are unique and precious. And they bring something to the world that wouldn't be there otherwise. My experience isn't particularly typical, but I think that's a strength in that a lot of people would be surprised to know that the children's ministry church lady in the next pew is actually queer. I think part of what the church could learn is that gay folks, queer folks aren't out there somewhere, out there as an enemy somewhere, but we're here. We're already here in the church. We're serving, we're gifts. And I think if more people realize that, the conversation would be different. The conservative church and the liberal church or progressive church can learn different things. So I think conservative churches can learn a lot about welcoming difference and welcoming variety and welcoming newness by looking to the queer people among them and the queer community. But progressive churches can learn that there's a value in those of us who want to stick to certain traditions. That sometimes tradition is life-giving. Sometimes even self-denial is life-giving, especially during Lent, right? We should all know about that. And I think that there are things that the more conservative or more traditional parts of the queer community have to offer to the more progressive wing of the queer community. And I think there are things that the more progressive wing of the queer community can offer to the more conservative wing of the church. And I think in our culture right now, we're so boxed, we're so siloed, that any hint of difference becomes a threat. And that's really sad. And I think the more we're around people who are different from us, the better off we'll all be. So